All right, let's get started. So on behalf of the BioBreak organization, I'd like to welcome you to another installment of BioBreak's, it's a BYOC, bring your own coffee, but I think we should add tea for tea, series, and the final one for 2020. Today's discussion topic is advancing diversity, equity, and inclusion in life sciences. And I am humbled and honored to be here today with such an esteemed group of panelists who will be discussing an incredibly important topic that's just vital to the fabric of our society. So a few housekeeping items before we get started. We very much welcome an interactive panel, so please feel free to submit any questions that you may have to address, and we'll address it during the hour. And to do so, you'll see that there's a Q&A feature if you hover over the bottom of your screen. We'll be recording this session, and a playback will be available for all attendees afterward. And last but certainly not least, we'd like to thank our sponsor, Locust Walk, which is a global life science transaction firm. And I'm actually the Chief People Officer for them. It's a great, great company. So let's begin with quick introductions of our panelists. Hope, would you like to go first?
Sure. My name is Hope Doyley-Gay. I am General Counsel and VP of Administration at Spirovant Sciences, which is a gene therapy company focusing on developing therapies for cystic fibrosis and other respiratory diseases. We're based in Philadelphia, in the University City area. Before that, I'm a lawyer by training, so I was in private practice, also supporting pharmaceutical and biotechnology companies. And prior to that, I spent almost 15 years at GlaxoSmithKline doing transactions supporting their worldwide business development units.
Thank you. Carrie, would you like to go?
Sure, Amy. Hi, I'm Carrie Gilman. I'm the Senior Manager of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at Goodwin Proctor, which is a global law firm. I'm based out of our New York office, but we are all over the country and Europe and in Asia with a robust life sciences practice. And that's the nexus for me being here today. Previous to my role with Goodwin, I was practicing with the Public Defender's Agency in Massachusetts, so I sort of have my roots in legal public interest law.
Love it, thank you. And Ken?
Yes, hi, I'm Ken Pugh. I'm the head of US Marketing and Alliance Management at Photocure. And Photocure is a bladder cancer company that's providing innovation to help diagnose and detect and survey bladder cancer more accurately. I have over 30 years of experience in the life sciences industry. I started out in sales with a large pharmaceutical company and advanced into levels of increasing responsibility across multiple different companies. I've worked in large companies, small companies, startups, and I'm really happy to be here.
Excellent, thank you. And Dee McDougal, last but absolutely not least.
Hey, Dee McDougal. I am Senior Vice President in Diversity and Inclusion at Pacific Western Bank. PWB is a BioBreak sponsor, and through our venture banking division, we serve technology and life sciences companies across the country. So yeah, happy to be here.
Thank you. Wow. So I'm very happy to be here with all of you. Let's get started with our Q&A. And this first question is actually 3 parts. So why is diversity, equity, and inclusion important, which is the broad one? Why should it be relevant to everybody listening? And what are the consequences of not having a diverse team? Hope, do you want to kick this one off?
Okay, sure. Diversity, DEI is important, really, I think because innovation is critical to the success of life sciences. And in order to have that innovation, you need to focus on diversity, equity, and inclusion. I think just starting first with diversity, again, it's hard to be innovative with people who have the same backgrounds or the same life experiences. There's really no diversity of thought or approach with that model. Innovation is really about thinking differently, doing something that's never been done before. And you're able to do that when you include people with different expertise, with different backgrounds, different perspectives. But then I go to the inclusion. Diversity is great, and we need that for innovation, but it goes hand in hand with the inclusion piece. You cannot have diversity without inclusion. There is a well-known speaker on diversity issues. Her name is Renee Myers, and she likens diversity to being invited to the party and inclusion is being asked to dance. If you're not asked to dance at the party, you're going to want to leave. And inclusion is about ensuring that once you get that diverse talent in-house, you want to keep them there. You want to make certain that they're valued, that they feel that their opinions matter. And you also want to position them for success within your organization. So it is important, and it's important for everyone listening in the life sciences because of that need to innovate. And I think the opposite is true too. If you don't have a diverse team, that really stifles innovation within your company.
Great, thanks. Wow, what a great quote to start. Invited to the party and then asked to dance. That's terrific. Thank you. Ken, do you want to add?
Yes, just to piggyback off what Hope said, I think diversity, equity, inclusion is really important. I believe it's a moral imperative. Most companies have policies around non-discrimination. So if you have an active diversity, equity, inclusion program, I believe that you can successfully kind of root out and try to work against discrimination. So I think that's one thing. To add to what Hope said, I think it's really important because it inspires trust in an organization. So when you think about having people who are fully engaged, you can have more engagement from everyone, not just the people of color or diverse backgrounds, but every individual. When your company starts to look like the rest of the nation, right? And I've read some empirical studies, and there's a Harvard Business Review publication recently that talked about the importance of the diversity and inclusion, and that it actually leads to better decision making, right? Because you have diverse thoughts, you have diverse opinions, and the quality of work actually goes up. And then lastly, when you think about diversity and inclusion, there's been empirical evidence that shows if it's diffuse and it's sustained over time, and when I say diffuse, it's part of every level of the organization, you have better financial sort of outcomes. So those are reasons why it makes sense, and without it, you wouldn't have those things flowing as freely and as appropriately within your organization.
Thank you. Carrie or Dee, would you like to add anything from your experience?
Carrie, you go.
I mean, I think Hope and Ken covered it, but I would amplify some of what they said, right? So Ken, the point that you were just making, several years ago now at this point, Google came out with a study. It was when businesses and organizations were first trying to build the business case around DEI, which talked about exactly all the things that you just referenced. Right. So when you have diverse teams, you have diversity of thought. They are more productive teams. They are increasing revenue streams, right? All these things that are business imperatives that it sort of feels like a no-brainer to bring into your organization. And we continue to see that research validated year after year as other studies come out sort of looking at the same things. But then I would go to what Hope and Ken, you also referenced too, right? The inclusion piece. So inclusion and belonging are directly connected to engagement and retention of employees. And engaged and retained employees are sort of what we are all seeking, right? So there is a lot there, right, that we all should be really focused on. And you really can't have one without the other. You can't have diversity without the inclusion, and taking it further without equity in your systems and creating belonging within your organization and for your employees. I really like to think about Goodwin as a community and talk about it that way to really build in that sense of inclusion and belonging.
Thank you. Dee, anything you want to add, or we will move to the second question?
I think I would just add that without it, the company would waste money because you're not going to be able to retain employees. There is a cost to not having a culture of inclusion within your organization. There is a cost to pursuing diverse talent and not having a culture where they feel welcomed and valued and they leave. So there's a cost associated with not prioritizing diversity, equity, and inclusion. There are all the benefits that were just named, but there really is a cost to not prioritizing this as a strategic business imperative. So I think that when we consider all the conversation that's going on around this, it isn't just because it's the right thing to do or a moral imperative. This really is strategic to business success.
Yeah, and I would just add one thing because I love that initial quote is when Ken mentions the HBR article about better decision making. If you think about it, it's like being invited to the party is just being hired, but being asked to dance means that we have to allow people to actually have the voice.
Absolutely.
So I think that's really interesting. Thank you. Okay, so let's move on. What are the DEI issues facing the life sciences industry in particular? If we can talk about that a little bit. Hope, do you want to start us off?
Sure. I think life sciences, like other industries, there's some similarities. I think one major issue is perhaps the lack of women in senior management or C-suite roles, or even, and then less even at the board level. Women are, and I've seen data on this recently, women are well represented in lower levels within life sciences, almost 50%. But as you move up the ladder, that number just decreases slowly, not slowly, and sometimes it's a drastic decrease. And then, as I said, as you go up to the board level, it's even less. I think this is probably similar to most industries. I don't think the life sciences industry is unique in that regard. That's also the same with, I think, with racial minorities. You have a greater representation at the lower levels, but then that drastically decreases as you move to senior management, C-suite, and the board. I think what is unique about life sciences and DEI issues is with respect to the minorities at the lower levels. And what we've seen is that most minorities at lower levels, and there aren't that many of them, but for most of those who are there, most of them are Asian. And there are very few Black or brown people anywhere in any really groups or divisions within these companies. So I think as a result, there's been a focus among a lot of our local life sciences companies to see what we can do to rectify that, to get more underrepresented racial groups into life sciences. And that's whether through our hiring initiatives, really being more intentional about getting people in, or cultivating that talent, trying to build the pipeline so that we're not digging around, that there are people there who have the skill sets that we need. So I think that is probably the biggest difference in our industry versus other industries.
Thank you. Ken, do you want to add anything?
I think Hope said it really well. When I look around the life sciences industry, and I've been in the industry 30 years, and I started out in sales, and I saw very few people at every level of the organization that looked like me. And I saw people leave the life sciences industry because they didn't feel like they were included. And we weren't talking about inclusion back then the way that we're talking about it now, 30 years ago. But I think maybe we could have retained some of those folks if we had more intentional efforts at the early stages, me being a sales rep among a bunch of other sales reps. And the other thing I think about for today is that there is a dearth of minorities at the executive and C-suite level. I think we can get better at that, and we have to look for candidates who are ready now to fill that gap, because it'll be another 30 years or more, if we start at the most junior level to find the people who are appropriate for executive leadership. So I think organizations need to be intentional about looking for those folks, whether it's through programs with affinity groups, through industry groups, by inviting groups into those industry sessions. I've been at industry symposia and meetings where you don't see a lot of diverse people there. I know there's a few organizations locally who are starting to reach out to historically Black colleges, universities, which is a great thing to get folks involved. And so you have to do it not only at the undergraduate level, you got to do it at the master's level, you got to do it at the PhD level, you got to do it in network, if you will, through those organizations and the people who are affiliated with those organizations and with broader groups to find the top talent. So it's going to be an effort of constant action. It needs to be work achieved to get there. So I think that's what we're dealing with right now.
That's really helpful. And actually, this is a good segue from Ramani. A question. The real question is not whether we should have DEI initiatives, which we should, but rather how we make this happen. So without any further delay, how do we ensure we're reaching out to and engaging with diverse candidates? Where are the quick wins? Anybody want to jump in?
So I'll start by saying that yes, quick wins feel good, but sustainable change is what we're after. And so I think that there are some things that you can do as a leader within any company that you might not have been doing before. So to Ken's point, establishing relationships with diverse talent pipeline organizations. So whether it's HBCUs or other alumni associations or whatever for your industry. So it could be, National Black MBA or Hispanica or other organizations to source the talent that you want. But again, there's work that needs to be done within your own organization to make sure that talent is going to come into an environment where they feel welcomed and valued. And so are you training people on how to be an inclusive leader? Do you know what that looks like? Do you really understand what the landscape is for diverse talent within your organization right now? If you have a problem retaining diverse talent, do you understand that maybe people aren't leaving just because they see a new opportunity? Maybe they're leaving because they don't feel welcomed and valued. So you really have to hold a mirror up to your own organization to understand what the challenges might be, address those, and then also do that external work to go out and source talent. There are lots of organizations that focus exclusively on sourcing diverse talent and serving diverse talent in different industries. And so I think that we also have to get over that hurdle and obstacle where people say, oh, there's a pipeline shortage. That's not true. There's lots of diverse talent out there. You just have to know where to go to find them. And so partnering with different organizations, partnering with recruiters and search firms that prioritize diverse talent, those are the things, the actionable things that you can do today to increase the diversity in your talent pipeline.
Excellent, thank you. Anything to add? And then we have another comment.
I might just add to what Dee is suggesting is if you have the capability within your organization, it's important to look at the data, that you need to know where the gaps are. So if you are, concerned anecdotally that you might have significant attrition for particular populations within your organization, take a look. See if what you feel really matches up to what the numbers tell you. And I think you can sort of back into some of your strategies from there, right? So we noticed that we had particular attrition, disproportionately high attrition for our Black and Latinx associates at the more junior level than their white majority counterparts. And so we backed into a recruiting strategy based on that data information. So everything that Dee just said, but see if you can get your hands around some data in your organization as well.
Yeah, and the other thing I'll add to that is it's really important to be, again, intentional and be looking at this. It's not going to change or improve without those actions. And I'll take my organization. We are 80 employees worldwide. We're in 10 different countries. We're not a startup, but we are early in our sort of commercialization. We currently have more than 60% female at the leadership level. We have around 23% of our US organization are minorities, which kind of mirrors the US population, but we're not satisfied. We want to do more. And so we're looking at everywhere where we can make a difference when it comes to having people join us and stay with us. So that is part of our value structure. And I think I'll talk about that a little bit more later.
Great, thank you. And we have another question. This is great too. It parlays right into what we're discussing from Frederick Jones. Quotas have been successful in some jurisdictions to raise the percentage of women on boards. What do you think of quotas as a strategy to raise minority representation at various levels of the business? It's a great question. I'm sorry we didn't think of it.
So I don't think that the term quota is what I would use. I do think targets are always helpful. I think tying senior leadership accountability to those targets is also really helpful. The reason I don't like the term quota is because, again, you go on this diverse hiring spree to meet your quota, but you haven't done the internal work to make sure that there's retention. And so when there's targets for what you want to see in your pipeline, and you have an applicant tracking system that can help you assess what your diversity or your applicant pool looks like, that's helpful. When you have targets that help you understand what you want to present as your interview slate, that's helpful. You want to look at the data, to Carrie's point, around how diverse candidates are making it through the hiring process. Is there a point where people fall off? That's helpful. Then the hiring, and then promotions and other employment actions. So those are the things that I think you want to have targets for, but you want to build a program that supports those targets in helping senior leaders achieve those goals. But I don't like the term quota. In some contexts, it's not an appropriate term to use, but I do think targets are helpful because we have those in all of the work that we do.
Great, thank you. Anything
I really agree with that, Dee, what you said about the quotas. I don't like the word, but I do like the target. I like that because quotas to me really talks about the hiring part, and it leaves out the inclusion, that retention there. But we're an industry where we measure everything we're measuring now. And there's always, people always say what doesn't get measured doesn't get done, and that's absolutely true. So I think it is good to have targets when it comes to diversity initiatives within your company, because if you don't, you're not being intentional about it, and it's not going to get done. You're not going to see any changes.
I couldn't agree more, Hope. And I love the quote because I use a similar version of that at Goodwin, which is, we can't improve that which we don't measure as well. And I share the same sentiment about quotas. I think we were planning to get to this a little bit later in the discussion, but I'm going to take us there now, unless Amy stops me, which is that, we went through sort of a philosophical questioning as an organization over the last couple of years of, we kept saying we wanted to do better on DEI, but we weren't defining that, and we weren't at the time willing to necessarily set targets or goals. And I think because there was some fear around the optics that might be looked upon like a quota, and that wasn't what we were striving to do. And we really started from a place of, how could we create goals around inclusion? What would that mean? What would that look like? And really started digging in, and actually earlier this year established 2 public goals. We call them goals, but called goals, targets, sort of same thing, that address both our sort of retention issues, our leaky pipeline issues with respect to sort of associates all the way up through our non-equity partner ranks. And then another goal that is specifically focused on the leadership profile of our organization. And those are things that we are going to now be working toward over the next 5 years. And it's out there in the market, right? So there's public accountability for us to achieve. And we are also building internal sort of accountability, ownership mechanisms as well. So I think really important to go there.
Excellent, thank you. And I think also, there's like a technical component and an adaptive component. The technical is sort of the target, but I like doesn't get measured, doesn't get done. So there's the target of the measurement, which is technical, but then there's all the adaptive work that has to be done to not only get it done, but then what happens, like we talked about, when people get there and how they feel, and the whole inclusive piece. So yeah, very, very interesting.
Amy, I think one of the things that we really have to remember about DEI work is it's all about behavior change. And behavior change is hard and it takes time. And not everyone is at the same place on the journey. That's another thing about diversity, equity, and inclusion work. It is absolutely a journey for everyone within an organization. And so while you can force diversity hires, you cannot force people to change their behavior in a way that drives inclusion. So that's what we need to really sort of, we talk about inclusion a lot, and for some people it sounds, cushy or, the hokey side of business, but that really is what we need in order for people to feel welcomed and valued so that they stay. And I'm not sure if we're going to talk about metrics too much today, but if anyone has questions about the different things that you can measure, drop a question in the chat, and I will just run down a list of things that you can measure within your organization that you might have access to through your HRIS platform or whatever it is that you're using, just to get an idea and create a little dashboard so you can have a better understanding of actually what's happening within your organization.
That's terrific. Thank you. All right, I'm going to move on to the next question. So this is also a hybrid question. Can you first explain to all of us what implicit bias is and how it plays a factor in the success or failure of diversity in general and the initiatives that surround it? And one other point to this, if anyone wants to jump in, if you're open to it, it might be helpful to hear specific stories of implicit bias that you've either experienced yourself or have been privy to. So 2-point question. Carrie, do you want to start us off?
I'm gonna let Dee take this one first.
Okay, so just really quickly, unconscious bias can be defined by or as just sort of this unconscious attribution that our brains assign to certain things. And so it's, certain people are this way or certain people are that way. And it's not done intentionally, it's unconscious. And so it just happens. People see a certain thing and their brain thinks something. And that's really simply what unconscious bias is. But unconscious bias isn't always bad. Unconscious bias saves our brain's time in certain instances. But where unconscious bias gets in the way with respect to diversity, equity, and inclusion is where you assign meaning to something that isn't necessarily there. And so a funny story about bias, and this goes with names. So my real name, or my full name, is Diaz McDougal. And when I was 25, I was working in a commercial real estate firm, and I was interviewing someone, and we'd only corresponded by email. And my email at the time was diaz.mcdougal. And so the receptionist tells me that the person is here to meet me. I go around the corner and she looks shocked. And so, we ended up hiring the young lady and we became friends. And later she said, Dee, when I saw Diaz McDougal, I did not expect a spunky Black woman to come around the corner. Like, I didn't know, when I saw your name, I did not know what to expect. I assumed that I was going to see a short, whatever her assumption was based on my name. People talk to you on the phone. They think that you're one way because of your voice. So this is where sort of your brain is making connections that aren't necessarily true, because my name's Diaz, I'm a Black woman. My last name is McDougal, I'm a Black woman. But for the way some people process that in their brain, who I am doesn't necessarily make sense for what they assumed based on the limited information that they know. Silly little story, but that happens every day. You see someone who's tall, and you see a tall Black man, you say, oh, do you play basketball? Not necessarily. So there are things that our brains just assume based on what the brain's been told over time. And that's just the little shortcuts that our brains take. But the way that turns out at work is that people make assumptions based on what they see and not the full picture. That's just a little bit about unconscious bias. So I think that the way it gets in the way at work is people don't have an opportunity to show up as themselves because bias gets in the way of what other people think of them. People don't make it to the interview process because there's a name on a resume that doesn't sound professional. People don't make it, through the interview process because they don't fit the mold of what has been successful within an organization. And again, that's not based on their experience. That's based on unconscious bias. Unconscious bias also shows up in the form of microaggressions as well. We call that, death by 1,000 paper cuts. It's the tiny little things that people do or say. So if you know someone who might be living with a disability, they may say something along the lines of, oh my gosh, but you're just doing so well. Like, it's like you're not even disabled. But again, that's not really positive language that we need to be using. Other microaggressions are around Black women and hair. Hope's hair is different from my hair. My hair could look like Hope's tomorrow. And they, oh, Dee, like, is that your hair? Or they'd ask if this is my hair today. So there are things and liberties that people take in the area of microaggressions and in unconscious bias, and that's how it shows up. And if you're on the receiving end of that, that can really erode away how you feel about yourself and your confidence. And we won't get into this today, but there's a whole thing around imposter syndrome that goes along with unconscious bias and microaggressions in the workplace.
Yeah, and I'll add my experience with that. So I'll rewind the clock to 1990. And when I got hired as a sales rep to a company, they're going through some expansion. And back in the 90s, people may have remembered the term of affirmative action. And I've had two different people mention affirmative action to me after I was hired, and they were non-minority. And one person was saying it as a compliment. I'm glad affirmative action is working. The other person said it as, well, you were hired because of affirmative action. Sort of like if it was someone else, they would have gotten a job ahead of you but you got it because you're Black. Those two things I still remember very vividly. Mm-hmm. And I worked my tail off to prove them wrong, that I got the job because of me. I had the qualifications. And so I kept it as a motivator going forward. But I know some people who felt that and decided to leave and go somewhere else where they felt like they belonged. So we talk about inclusion. So I didn't feel included at the time because of those two comments, but I felt like I had to do the right thing to get to the next level, to prove to myself, because I started getting that imposter syndrome myself at the time, like maybe I wasn't qualified to do this job. And then when I started having successes along the way, whether it was in my first role, my second role, my 10th role, it was, I do belong, right? So I think people need to know that it can cut both ways depending on how you say it. Yeah.
So I think, here too, right, implicit bias is also known as unconscious bias. And because of that, we all have unconscious biases or implicit bias, by the way, right? But because of that, we're not aware of them. And so I think this goes to sort of another piece of your question, Amy, which is, what can we do about it, right? Which is that this is where it sort of takes, the strategy to looking at structural, pieces of your organization, processes within your organization, and what are you doing to shift those or change them so that we're mitigating the impact of individuals' unconscious bias. So there's a study that I think is sort of worth mentioning here. It's specific to the legal industry, but I think it will resonate. So there was a study where there were a bunch of law firm partners who were given a brief written by a third-year law student. Right, and half of the law firm partners were told that the student was a white man by the name of Thomas Meyer, and the other half were told that he was a Black man, same name, and they were asked to mark up the brief. Mm-hmm. And not only were the comments significantly harsher for the Black man, but one partner went so far as to write, "This person would never be successful in the law firm environment." Same exact brief, same name, just difference in understanding of the race of the individual that they were assessing. And this is unconscious bias at work in our organizations and in our systems. And so, what are steps that we could have taken, right? Obviously, this was a study intended to sort of elicit response and see what happened there. But, information, covering up names on resumes, right? Dee was sort of making that reference before about names can even be a barrier to get you into the interview process and really have impact on assessment. So you can do blind studies of resumes or in assessing candidates, right? So there are all sorts of tweaks we can make in our systems throughout what we sort of call the employee life cycle experience, right? Everything from recruiting and hiring and assessment and advancement all the way through to when somebody might leave your organization. But it's real. And we need to be sort of, thinking about how we can address and make some tweaks in our organizations.
Very helpful to understand. I just want to let all the panelists know that Dee just sent the list that she referenced before into the chat feature. So please feel free.
Yeah, I just resent it to all attendees because I messed that up on the first go round. So it should be there for everyone.
Thank you. So let's move on. Please discuss a transformational experience that you've had that led to impactful change, either in your career or even in your life. And then the second part of the question, if relevant, would be, has allyship ever played a role in your career trajectory? And maybe explain that situation, because it would be interesting to hear, and people love stories. So who would like to start? Ken?
Oh, sure.
I think you might have a story for us.
Yeah, I have a story. So as I mentioned, I started my career 30 years ago in sales. And I was, one of the many people hired during that time, and I didn't see a lot of people in executive leadership who looked like me. And then one day I saw this Black woman who, was in executive leadership. She was on stage at a national meeting, and I was inspired. And I found out about her profile and her background. I'm like, wow, if she can do it with a similar background as mine, perhaps I can do it. But again, I didn't see a lot of faces like that. So I wanted to believe, but I wasn't sure how I could get there. And so that was in the first decade of my career. And so within that decade, I got promoted into the home office. And so I was probably in my 5th year in my career. And I took on a job that not a lot of people would have taken on because it was a pilot job. It was a unique position that was new to the company within a big company. So it was a little scary because we're breaking new ground. And my first boss, who became a mentor of mine and a supporter and an ally, and I didn't know that term back then in the context of diversity, equity, inclusion, sat me down one day, and he was white, or he is white, so he wasn't a minority. And he sat me down and he said, "Ken, what do you want to do with your career?" And I didn't have a straight answer because I wasn't quite sure of all the home office jobs that were available, but I knew I wanted to make a real big difference. So all I said to him was, "I just want to make a big difference, and I'll go wherever my talent leads me. What do you think I should do?" So he sat me down and he outlined different roles I could take. You can go these 3 different prongs in your career. Within the home office, you can go back out to the field if you want to, you can do this. And so when I saw it written down, I'm like, oh my goodness, this is a roadmap toward potentially becoming like that woman I saw on stage. And he just stayed in touch with me after I moved on to a new role, actually one of those roles that he talked about. And he was a supporter and an ally as I started looking to get to that next role. And so I started going down the marketing trajectory. And I thought that was my best talent as I was pursuing my MBA while working for the big company. And we remained in contact as I continued to build my career at that company. And after I left that company, after being there for 10 years, we stayed in touch. And throughout my career, what I did was I not only had allies and supporters who were non-white. I had white supporters. I had supporters who were women, supporters who were different groups. And so I made sure my network was broad enough to help support my career. So I think that was transformational for him to sit down with me in my 5th year early on to give me that roadmap. And he said specifically, "Ken, there's no promises here, but if you work hard, if you make the right connections, and if you are successful, this is a potential for you." So that made a huge difference for me.
That's such a great story. Can you also just quickly explain allyship if people don't know what that is?
I'll talk about it from my perspective, and I'll turn it over to the D&I or DE&I experts to share their perspective. So for me, allyship is someone who is going to work with you as an ally to support you through things that are good and things that are bad, to put it simply, right? Support you as you think about your career, support you when you're not there, right? To sort of help champion you in those meetings where they're talking about, top talent, right? And they're calibrating folks in those meetings, but also someone who will stand up and say to someone who's saying something that could be implicit bias that's negative, say, that's not right. So me as an individual don't have to sort of raise it and confront that person that said the wrong thing. That ally could say it for me or for anyone else to support that person, to help them through navigating the tricky waters of those uncomfortable conversations around, being a minority in business. So that's the way I see it, but I'll turn it to others to speak to it more professionally.
Great. Hope, I just wanted to ask you, any stories as well, any transformational experiences?
Sure. I think as a Black woman, it is in corporate America, it is somewhat isolating. You are used to being often the only woman many times, but even when there are other women in the room, you are usually the only Black person in the room. So it is isolating. And you learn to adapt, you learn to push through. But one experience I had was when I was with GlaxoSmithKline, and I was working on a transaction with outside counsel from a very prominent law firm. And it was something that had to be done right away. We had a time crunch there. So we're working in the office. It's 2 o'clock in the morning. We're finishing up everything. We're getting signature pages out the door. And, we've been doing this for the whole week and it's exhausted, but it was the first time, I think I've been practicing at that time, I can't remember how long, and she was a few years older than me. She was also a Black woman. And it was the first time for either of us to have ever been in a closing with another Black person, frankly, within a Black woman. And it was a moment, it was a moment for the two of us. We were exhausted, but just to have that experience. And it made me think, and I've always been committed to DEI efforts before that, but it made me even more, just determined. I don't want to be the only one in the room anymore. I mean, it's just, I don't want that. I need to have someone else there with me. We need to bring people along, whether it's, for me, in-house counsel, diverse outside counsel, vendors that we use, employees. That is just so important to me. And I guess when you talk about allyship, I think my thoughts on that are very similar to what Ken said. I view it as somewhat of a sponsor, but I do leave it to Dee and Carrie to give me the correct interpretation. But for me, I think of it as a sponsor, someone who's really there. As Ken said, when you're not in the room, they're there advocating on your behalf. I have had people like that. There was a woman I used to work with at Glaxo. She was a senior vice president. And after we did a transaction, we completed a transaction, she said, now I'm going to write a note to the general counsel now. And I'm going to tell him what you did for me on this transaction. I mean, she did not have to do that. I did not ask her to do that. She knew what she needed to do to move my career forward. And as Ken said, unfortunately, most of my allies and sponsors have not been, they don't look like me. And I think that's because, as we said earlier, the more senior you get, there's just fewer of us. So white men, white women have been tremendous allies for me in my career. So I think that's my story. Yeah.
Thank you.
Sure.
Carrie and Dee, anything to add?
I might just put a little bit of a fine point on sort of definitions here, but Dee, jump in too. So I think, certainly you can have people in your lives and in your networks who occupy or are fluid, even frankly, across the roles of mentor, sponsor, and ally. So I like to think about a mentor as somebody who talks to you, advises you. A sponsor is somebody who will talk about you, advocate for you. And an ally might do a lot of sponsorship type of activities, but I also like to think of an ally as an upstander. So they're somebody acting on your behalf when you are the affected party in a particular situation, right? And you may be present or you may not. They're the person who's going to sort of step in and act on your behalf to disrupt, if there was a moment of unconscious bias, or maybe it was something more overt than that, right? Where it needs to be disrupted in the moment. An ally is not going to be a bystander. They're going to be an upstander.
Love that word.
Yeah.
Dee, anything that you want to add to this?
No, such rich conversation. So I think we're good on that.
Excellent, thanks. So beyond diversity and getting the right people on the team, how have you both, at least Dee and Carrie, approached creating an inclusive culture and environment? I'd like to start with both of you first.
Sure. So I think that culture piece is really the most important part. I think normalizing the conversation around diversity, equity, and inclusion is really important. I think that's happened a lot more since the summer and the murders of George Floyd and Aubrey and Breonna Taylor. People, out of that, I think companies found themselves at an inflection point where they just had to get comfortable with employees having these conversations in the workplace. And so that really kind of fast-tracked the ability to have conversations around race and ethnicity and then gender and other dimensions of diversity. Because in the past, for a lot of people, conversations about diversity typically happen within groups that are already diverse. But this summer forced those conversations to happen across the broader spectrum of employees within an organization. So I think that normalizing the conversation around these issues is the number one thing you can do to sort of drive that culture of inclusion so that people feel comfortable and get more comfortable talking about something that is awkward and uncomfortable for many people. I think also acknowledging, again, like I said before, that this is a journey and more marathon than sprint. And so we have to just acknowledge that this is something that everybody's doing sort of at their own pace and running their own race. And so again, what tools can we give people to be better about understanding microaggressions, implicit or unconscious bias, generational differences in the workplace, LGBTQ plus, challenges that might exist in the workplace. So what can we do to, again, normalize the conversation, provide content and opportunities for people to share stories. I really believe strongly in the fact that proximity breeds empathy. And so if you work in an organization where there's there isn't very much diversity, invite outside voices in so that your team can learn more about other people's experiences. And I think that is what, to Carrie's point, that's what disrupts the behavior that has continued to exist for so long. And so those are the things that we do at PWB. Again, lots of conversation. This summer hosted a series of talks around race, equity, and inclusion in the workplace, and really just provided a forum for employees to share their experiences. We highlight and spotlight employee stories all the time, again, just to make sure that people are learning about different people's backgrounds. Also, just trying to figure out a way to bring us together through that unifying culture while we're still celebrating and valuing difference. I think we have to also acknowledge that for a lot of people, they were raised in environments where they were taught not to see color and not to see gender and not to see difference. And now what we're asking them is, no, we want you to see those things. We just want you to appreciate it. And that's a really big shift and change in behavior. And so we have to be able to equip employees, with the tools and the skill set to be able to do those things. And so those are the things that we work on through the inclusion part of our strategy, the diversity outreach and hiring and partnering with learning and development, to make sure that people are getting the mentoring and sponsoring and that managers know how to sponsor, and really considering diversity when we're having succession planning conversations. That's all not new and different for everyone, but for some people, these are new skills that we're having to equip them to be able to do this work.
So interesting, because I've done a lot of work on having difficult conversations, but the fact that it sounds so easy, right? Just having these conversations in the workplace, but it's just not, because people were never taught how to have difficult conversations to begin with in life.
Right. And the vulnerability piece is really important as well. So, when we talk about feelings, right? So empathy and vulnerability, those are things that, sure, progressive leaders have talked about those things in the workplace, but for the longest time, like a leadership profile didn't include empathy and vulnerability on the nice to haves for leaders. And so that's new and different, I think, for a lot of people.
Yeah, I think it's a shift because, it's a lot of companies focused on, the other pieces, the more sort of, hard objective pieces, but this is more subjective. And what I'd love to see is for us to move from a place of, uncomfortable or courageous conversations to one of candid conversations, right? Where it becomes so normal that we're willing to have these candid conversations. And as you mentioned, Dee, it's going to take the proper tools, the proper sort of cadence around having those conversations to make more and more people more comfortable with being candid. Yeah.
Thank you. Carrie?
So agree with most of everything that Dee said. And for us, I think we sort of came to a place of reckoning with how do we focus on inclusion and what does that mean, probably a couple of years ago. And I think, Dee, you referenced this earlier in the conversation, but inclusive leadership training, like what does that mean and what does that look like, right? So we actually developed a training called Living Our Values, and it focused on harassment, bias, both conscious and unconscious, privilege, which is, I think, a bit of a newer conversation that a lot of organizations are having as organizations, right? And then going into a little bit of that like upstander versus bystander training that I was referencing earlier. And we disseminated this sort of throughout the US anyway. We didn't quite get to take it to our global offices pre-pandemic, but we were we were, sort of going to every office around the US and meeting with partners in separate sessions from associates versus professional staff, right? Really trying to separate out the power dynamics so that we could have these interactive, really deep conversations through our training process, 90-minute training, right? And we don't really mandate, that's not our way within our organization, but highly encouraged everyone to attend. And our training sessions were sold out and oversubscribed, right? And so the plan is to continue with that type of training. It was really built around hypos and talking out various scenarios and getting partners particularly to think really critically about how they lead and what that looks like. But one of the things that we are talking about within our firm is that we want everyone to think of themselves as a leader and to think about themselves as an inclusive leader, because everyone's managing someone, or, whether it's sort of in a direct reporting line or through a project or a collaboration, right? And we're all sort of working with each other all the time. And so what does inclusive leadership look like and what does it mean? Sort of around the same time, we also developed something that we call Week of Inclusion. And so it was intended to be both a celebration, and this is something we do globally in all of our offices. So both a celebration of who we are as a community, but also an opportunity to do some training and education. And so we started with bias and microaggressions, and this year focused on allyship. And to Dee's point about vulnerability and leadership, we kicked off that week with our chairman having a panel discussion with employees, lawyers, and professional staff from around the globe talking about their experiences with allyship. And so we are trying to bring storytelling into everything that we're doing and using it as a training tool and encouraging people to lead with vulnerability and through sharing their stories and their lived experiences. And we still, to this day, this program took place back in May, we are hearing that it was the best DEI program we've ever run. And, that I think speaks volumes about what it is that people are really seeking and what's resonating when we're going through sort of training programs and whatnot. So we're doing a lot of that type of programmatic firm-wide training work, but then, we're also really looking at our pipeline and where are the gaps in the pipeline and what work do we need to be doing, and a lot of one-to-one connection, particularly during this remote work time. We have tightened up and gotten really clear about expectations around our advisor program. We have a lot of mentoring and sponsorship happening sort of at all levels of the firm right now. And we've seen a marked difference in how people are engaging and sort of responding.
That's terrific. It's interesting. When a lot of people don't love the word training, it just turns them off because you think of sort of this traditional one person talking at a group for an hour. And when you said, I thought of sort of people are really craving depth and connection now. So it sounds like that program was just phenomenal.
And we did something similar. I'm sorry.
Okay.
I was going to say we did something similar at Spirovant. We were not a big company, so we don't have a lot of training programs and things like that to tap into. But particularly after the killing of George Floyd, and we're all working from home, we our CEO, we had a conversation about it, and she exposed herself, her vulnerabilities, and what she was thinking. And then as a team, we watched the movie 13th on our own, and then had a team discussion about it, everybody in the company. And as Dee said, those vulnerabilities, just getting that out there, people can share their experiences. We're all from so many different areas. So it was really a great way for a lot of those who might be on this call from smaller companies to just start having those conversations and creating that culture of empathy and vulnerability.
Amy, I'll just add one thing here. The training piece is important. However we define it, because people don't know how to do this.
Yeah.
People know how to manage the phenomenon of mini-me at work is easy because it's like, okay, well, I know what someone just like me needs. Mm-hmm. And so that's why I pick someone who's just like me. But when we're embracing diversity and we're inviting all these different voices and we have a hodgepodge of backgrounds in one place, people don't know how to have these productive and inclusion advancing conversations. And so we have to train them. just like you want to train a manager on how to be a good manager, you want to train someone and give them the tools and set expectations around how they show up in these instances. And I think for a long time, we took for granted that people just knew how to do it. And what we've learned is no, they don't. And so we really need to provide with the skill set to be able to do this, because it's what's required in order for us all to be successful.
Excellent point. All right, looks like I can move on. We're coming close to a close. So one more question. As a leader in the life science industry, what's some actionable advice to minority groups as they advance their careers in life sciences? And if you have any particular experiences as a Black professional, that would be great.
And I'll say a few things. And the first thing I'll say is that there's no one way. There's multiple ways from my perspective and what I've seen through people I've hired and people I've managed and people I've interacted with, how to go about this. But, one thing I would say is number one, build a network, right? Build a network of people who will be mentors, supporters, allies. And the second thing I'll say is be willing to have those courageous conversations, candid conversations. It's never going to be, it doesn't have to be perfect, but it has to happen. And I think people are open to having those conversations more and more because of the recent events within the United States and around the world. I think that's important. The other thing I think is really what I've taken is maintaining some level of objectivity about my career and how I wanted to pursue my career by speaking to others to get that feedback. And when you get feedback, whether it's through your direct manager in coaching and development, or it's through a mentor, try to remain objective about the feedback that you get along the way, because you can sort of fine tune your approach to your career with that. Maintain an antenna, because there's certainly people who may not have your best intent in mind. There's very few of them, but when they're there, you have to kind of know who are there and find your allies to support you through that. But I think it's being intentional about your career is critical. And then I think the other piece that's really important is be involved with different industry groups like this one, or life sciences PA, or others, bio, national sales network, which is largely for minority groups. Be involved with those, because it may open doors and open your eyes to many possibilities. And those are my thoughts.
Excellent.
Yeah, I agree with really most of what Ken said, as well as the affinity groups, because you are going to be the only one in the office. So it is good to go to a safe place where other people have had the same experiences that you've had. I also tell minority folks, we have this burden of being the only one, that we represent the entire race every time we walk into the office. That's a lot of pressure. What we need to do is just do our best, work hard, be prepared, do your best, and that's what you need to do. You're not carrying everybody on your shoulders when you're going into the office. It's too much to manage with everything else that's going on as well.
Thank you. That might be a good place to end. Any last comments?
Thanks for the opportunity to have this conversation. Hope it has been helpful.
We all do. It was really great. I can't thank my panelists enough. It was terrific. Thank you so much for joining, and just please stay safe and enjoy the holiday season. And we look forward to continuing the discussion. So thank you.
Thank you.
Here. Bye.
Thanks,
Everybody.